In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sanctifier. Amen. Please be seated. Now, would this have not made a perfect gospel reading for the stewardship campaign? I mean, seriously, one could not ask for a more wonderful scene than this to undergird the idea that all of us have something to contribute, no matter how small. The temple treasury is having a red-letter day. Rich and poor alike are walking up to the donation box to put in their contributions. However, all is not as rosy as it seems. Mark makes very clear that this crowd contains a lot of wealthy people and that they are putting a lot of money into the collection box. They may even be making a show out of it so they can't help but be noticed by anyone who might be standing around and watching. And Jesus, who is off to the side somewhere and watching all of this, looks right past them and notices someone else sticking out from the crowd like a sore thumb, a poor widow who has come by herself and put into the box the very last of her material resources. She and her motivations could not be any more different from the rest of the people there. And Jesus hammers that point home by pointing her out to the disciples as the one who has truly given the most. How lovely. But there is a great deal more going on here than just a story about someone who gives up everything she has for the good of the community, and with the undertone of that's what we should be doing too. This is not a story about how the most vulnerable are yet again asked to give up the most, or even about offering something as an act of devotion to God. Instead, this story is sandwiched among Jesus' harshest criticisms of the religious establishment of his day, an establishment which seems to have gotten so full of itself that it ignores its own basic rules for how people are to interact with God and with one another. That criticism is meant to point out just how backward the world was and still is compared with how it ought to be. We ought to be able to see and to treat with care and respect the most invisible people in the world, and yet we still have trouble doing that. We tend to get so caught up with our own stuff, our own status, on whatever it is, that we can't see any farther than the boundaries which our stuff creates for us. And for better or for worse, this kind of short-sightedness is human. Not that much has changed in the last 2,000 years since this story was written down, and that's part of why it's still relevant. Jesus draws our attention to it through his harsh criticism of those in positions of privilege within the religious establishment. And then he follows that up by going out of his way to point out the one individual whom this establishment decidedly is not. This one poor widow is a symbol of Jesus's and God's upside-down way of putting people first who would otherwise remain invisible. That Jesus notices her, one of the most invisible people of her time, is remarkable, perhaps even more so than what she has done. But by putting her last 2 cents into the box, she has given up everything she has to support an institution which, despite the best intentions of its founders, seems to have grown corrupt. And in the process of that growing corrupt, its leaders have also lost the ability to look beyond their own self-interests to those of the wider community, including widows, orphans, and anyone else lacking someone, particularly a male blood relative, to provide for them. Now, standing in direct contrast to this widow, we have a group of scribes who seemed only to be in it to be seen wearing their long robes and to get the best seats at dinner. In other words, it's become all about them and maintaining their privileged positions instead of offering what they have to serve others, like the poor widow. And whatever word we might use to describe them, whether it's narcissistic, self-centered, self-serving, stuck up, or just plain ignorant, these scribes are decidedly not the ideal role model. Instead, they've become hypocrites, leaders whose failure to put their money where their mouths are, that opens them up to the harshest words that Jesus has to offer. Because they are so well educated, they of all people should know what the law requires of them, and yet they still make the choice to act in ways intended to draw attention to them, instead of using their power and their knowledge to set a positive example for everyone who was watching. And what's worse, they're greedy for power, at least within their religious sphere. And when it is given to them, they turn around and they use it to devour widows' houses, instead of obeying the mandates in the Torah to ensure that those widows are provided for. In pointing out the scribe's bad habits at the end of a chapter where he has already spent quite a lot of time arguing with them, Jesus turns things upside down yet again. As a symbol of the down and out, it's the widow who demands our attention, and not the scribes and all their self-importance and their swishy robes. The Old Testament is very, very clear on this count. The law codes lump together widows, orphans, and strangers into a category as a people who must not be abused, lest God's wrath be kindled against them. And Psalm 94 goes even a step further in describing those who do so as evildoers. And the prophet Isaiah even gets in on the action. He says this, "Ah, you who make iniquitous decrees, who write oppressive statutes, to turn aside the needy from justice and to rob the poor of my people of their right, that widows may be your spoil and that you may make the orphans your prey. What will you do on the day of punishment, in the calamity that will come from far away? To whom will you flee for help, and where will you leave your wealth, so as not to crouch among the prisoners or fall among the slain? For all this, his anger has not turned away. His hand is stretched out still." And again, the scribes should know this better than almost everyone else, and they've chosen not to act like it. And no matter what the excuses they might come up with for their behavior, it raises the question of what has gotten in their way. Is it the seductive trap of being liked and respected everywhere they go? Or is it the material rewards that respect commands? Or is it something else? Since they're human, the answer to that is probably all of the above. And I would bet we all know someone like that and have acted that way ourselves from time to time. But fortunately for us, we are blessed with a whole community of people here to tell us when we've gotten to that point. And hopefully, those people will also help us to begin to make the changes we need to make so we can pull our heads and our hands out from underneath our robes. And unfortunately for the scribes, they don't seem to have that kind of support as readily available as we do. Jesus tries to get them to stop and look in the mirror, seemingly to no avail. But at least Mark never tells us if he succeeded at that job or not. But regardless, the point is that to see things upside down is in God's kingdom is what matters, period. Instead of desperately trying to get others to compliment us on our finery, we should be paying attention to the widow, the orphan, the stranger, all the people that we might not even notice otherwise. And that is how to turn things upside down by the world's reckoning. The great thing is, that's right side up when it comes to God's way of doing things. Michael Curry, our new presiding bishop, in the sermon he preached at his installation last Sunday, put it this way. Yes, God, the way of God's love turns our world upside down, but that's really right side up. And in that way, the nightmare of this world will be transfigured into the very dream of God for humanity and for all creation. My brothers and sisters, God has not given up on God's world. God has work for us to do. Jesus has work for us to do, and it's the Jesus movement. So don't worry. Be happy. My friends, we have been given a job to do, and that's to go out and serve the people in our town who most need what we have to offer. Everyone has something to contribute. Whether it's material resources, your time, or the embarrassing wealth of talent that's sitting right out here. We need it all. Our very survival depends on our taking it and dropping it into God's collection box. And just as we will do later in this service with our gifts of bread and wine in the Eucharist, we will give thanks, ask God to bless it, and then marvel at what God will do with it. Amen.